Hey, thanks for joining me. Today, our topic is Amazonian Forest Islands Evidence of Ancient Human Origins. I know you're thinking, forest islands. I thought that all the Amazon was a forest. It's all a tropical forest. But no, the Amazon basin is absolutely an enormous region, all of central South America. And many parts of it are fairly dry, desert-like, and then there's regions that are like this one in this picture here, which is extensive grasslands, marshlands, and it's in these regions in Bolivia, in the shadow of the Andes Mountains, where we find these enigmatic features on the landscape called forest islands. And then you can see here's the grassland, marshland, basically large wetland, floodplain. And then there are these little pockets of trees. And the thing that's notable about these trees is the trees are growing on a slightly elevated piece of land, right? A foot to 2 foot to maybe 3 foot higher than the surrounding area, which is really incredibly flat. And so, any person interested in the topography of this world and what creates the different landforms should naturally ask the question: where do these forest islands come from? What's their origin? How did these little spots get higher elevation than the area around them when it all appears that this is just one big muddy plain from large floods in the past? So there are a number of different hypotheses about how such forest islands could have originated. Maybe they're just the remains of a previous topography where there were hills in this particular area, and then those hills were surrounded by floods that came in and brought sediments, and these are just sort of the peaks of those hills. You could also suggest maybe this was just there happened to be one tree that managed to survive in a floodplain, and then below that tree, because of the shade, different plants grew there, which sort of helped hold the soil together. And then the tree drops its leaves, and then eventually organic material builds up, and you sort of have a long progression of material sort of compacting in that particular spot. And once it reaches a higher elevation, then maybe animals come there, stay, and add fertilizer, which creates more plants. And then it's sort of a natural growth versus via all the different natural processes that might occur in the area. So that's a very, I think, a sound hypothesis, but very testable hypothesis. And there was a group of scientists that went out, and they were curious too. Where did these forest islands come from? What are they made of? How did they originate? Because there's hundreds of these particular islands of forest. And these forests are anywhere from maybe 50 feet in diameter to up to maybe 200 feet in diameter. So this isn't a single tree. There's a whole grove of trees on some of these. Yeah, so we were talking about central Bolivia, and the research article I'm going to talk about is looking at several different forest islands in this region and assessing their origins. And this picture down here on the bottom shows you from a side angle. You're looking at a grassy or a marshland, very, very flat. And then, boom, there's these trees standing out there. So how might you go about investigating what the origins of these are? Well, you need to know what these particular islands are composed of. So some researchers went out and they dug into these islands and explored their physical makeup, and I'm going to show you that in just a moment. But here's another picture from a satellite image, and let me get my pen here. And so this is the one island in particular that we're going to explore in more depth in just a few moments. But you can see here's another little grove of trees over here. And then there's another smaller, actually fairly large one, but that's not as distinct down here. So here are these various islands. This is 200 feet wide. So this is only 400 or 500 feet away. There's another set of another forest island. And so the paper I want to discuss with you is one from 2013, and I've just periodically come back to this article because I just find it so fascinating. And just such a kind of a simple study, but a powerful study in terms of like, hey, we go collect data, and all of a sudden we have our answer, and it's kind of surprising. Early and middle Holocene hunter-gatherer occupations in western Amazonia, the hidden shell middens. And I think that title is going to tell you a lot of what the answer is here, right? They're going to suggest that these islands, these forest islands, are actually the product of human occupation. They're not going to argue that humans intentionally made these particular islands, but they're going to say they're unintentional consequences of humans living in this particular area, and specifically hunter-gatherers in the Holocene period. And we'll talk about what the timing is there in a moment. And they are hidden shell middens. Well, a midden, if you don't know what a midden is, maybe you've heard of a pack rat midden. And a pack rat midden is all the material you might find in a pack rat's nest, right? Where they go out and they collect material from other areas and they produce these massive nests. And they can be very valuable to scientists because they can take a look at the nest, and especially ones that have been preserved for maybe thousands of years. And it gives you an idea of what type of plants and so forth were in that area at the time that pack rat was collecting stuff, right? It's like a little treasure box. Well, in this case, they are shell middens, and a shell midden is a collection of shells, a giant mound of shells that result in some sort of purposeful activity in which shells are all placed in one place versus scattered randomly in the environment. And so to give away the biggest part of the story, these forest islands are standing on an absolutely massive amount of snail shells, all of the same type of snail. Hundreds of millions of snail shells all piled up in one spot, creating an elevation that's above the plain around it. And the reason trees grow on these particular spots is because of the higher elevation, right? The water table is actually quite high in all the land around it, since it is a marsh grassland, depending on the seasons. And that's not conducive to most tree growth, tree survival. But then because of the slight elevation change, right, there's better drainage at that particular spot. They're above the water table, a little higher, allowing for these trees to grow. And so it's not as if somebody planted the trees there. It's simply that the trees have found those spots amenable to living, right? There's trees in surrounding regions, and seeds are dropped all over this marshland, but they're not successful. But on these particular mounds, they are. All right, so this is by Lombardo et al., which is a whole bunch of people who worked with him to do these experiments on these forest islands. All right, so let's just get right to the main figure. That's really all I need to show you. I'm going to show you. So here is a little cross-section of their work. And so what they've done here is this particular spot right here, they dug a pit. All right, they dug a pit down almost 6 feet deep down to the water table in the center of one of these large mounds that was about 200 feet in diameter. So they went to the center of this mound and they just started digging. And as they dug, they identified all along the way what they were seeing as they're digging down, right? They're creating a cross section of the mound. And they also took organic samples, remains of bones and other pieces of debris that were inside of the cross section, or this pit. Sent those off for carbon-14 dating, and you can see the carbon-14 dates here. The bottom of their pit was dated to be 6,549 years, plus or minus 105 years. And they also have samples from cores, so all these different spots here represent a core section. So they took a core section, so they drilled down into this all the way down, I think some 6 or 7 feet deep. And at the bottom of the core, or at least the place where this what's called paleosol, or this silty layer, which underlies all of the mound, plus all of the plain out here. And so out here you have, out here you've got right now the current level of the soil, right, with your grassy plain out here. But below that, what they found is that there is 4 to 5 feet of silt and clay that are sitting on top of a silty layer, which is rather uniform below it, which represents presumably a previous flood plain. And these mounds are actually constructed on top of this even mud plain, all right, silty plain. And you have that boundary layer between the mound and what's below it. All right, what it's built on is about 10,000 years old by carbon-14 dating. So what they're saying is these are massive mounds, which are almost exclusively, right? The majority of the material of this mound is not soil. All right, it's not mud, it's not silt, it's not rocks. Rocks really aren't known to this region at all. There's no stones at all at this particular site. What they found is that this is all just compacted shells. Millions and millions and millions and millions of shells upon shells. But intermixed in those are bone fragments. And at the top, right up here in this top layer, which isn't all shells, there's this broken up layer of debris on top, which covers a lot of organic remains. So suggesting that's when you have trees on top. They're leaving organic material, but you also have various shards of pottery at this point, and those are considered sort of pre-Columbian aged pottery. So there's a variety of methods. You can date pottery, but it's also the type of pottery, and other archaeological sites in South America, they can correlate the type of pottery that's here with other types of pottery there. But the carbon dating for the bottom of this sort of top layer on top of the mounds is about 4,000 years ago. Now, previous studies have actually, people have looked at, wandered around these mounds, and they have found evidence of human occupation on top of the mounds, but nobody had really dug into the mound before and to realize that the mound itself is not made up of the stuff you see at the top of the mound, but is actually made up of enormous numbers of shells. And so now, to continue the study, they did cores come, from the center, right? So they cored down here. They cored over here near the edge of the mound, and then they cored out here at different intervals. And that's where they discover that the mound actually goes underneath the present-day soil layer, and then kind of spreads out until eventually you reach a point where you don't find any shells anymore, and you just find the direct contact of the modern sediments, floodplain sediments, with older floodplain sediments below it. And so these mounds have an origin in that sense, right? They don't come from deep down in the earth. So this isn't the top of a hill that was buried. This is something that if you went back in time, there was a flat plain. And on that flat plain, then shells were deposited, and eventually the shells built up. Now, it's like how would that happen? What the scenario would be something like, hey, you've got a grassy land or some kind of landscape. I'm not exactly sure what the composition exactly of the land was at that time, but it had to have enough moisture that there was this particular type of snail that lived there, and that particular snail also lives in this region today. And at the time, apparently there were people there. And you would say, well, how do you know that people laid down these shells? Well, I forgot to mention that embedded throughout this particular section that they dug down into, but also in the cores, there are burnt layers. All right. And so it's as if there's many, 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 many different hearths there. People had been building fires. There are also pieces of bones from a variety of different animals. Some of those with different kinds of marks on them, suggesting that this was humans that were processing these particular animals here and probably eating them there. And so you can kind of envision this is a spot where there was like a little camp, right? Or a place where you gather and eat your food. And how would that begin? Now, there's hundreds of these little spots all over in this area of Bolivia. And these authors haven't investigated all of them. They only looked at 3 of them, but the 3 that they looked at all were shell mounds. And so it wouldn't be surprising at all if many of the others, if not most of these other islands that look the same, are also shell mounds. And so I can envision like you have a grassy plain and you have hunter-gatherers who are out there looking for food, and these snails were a convenient form of food, but there were also different kinds of game. And you find some shells, and maybe you had these paths, and where two paths intersect, you come and you're standing there, and you got a couple people there, you're eating your shells. Maybe you make a little fire there, you cook stuff up, and you drop the shells there, right? And if you do that enough time, pretty soon you have a whole bunch of shells right there. And the shells get compacted into the soil, maybe produce sort of a drier place to stand in a wet season. They begin to pile up a couple inches high, but they also just become a sort of a marker, right? You're in an area where everything looks the same as far as you can see. And this is kind of like a location now, which is unique and different than everywhere else you've been. You tell the kids, hey, go out and get the snails, and we'll come back to X site, right? Where we process them. And then there's more snails there, and then there's more shells there, and then there's more shells there, and more shells there. And as the shells pile up, then that particular spot becomes more and more different over time and becomes more unique. And being more unique, it attracts you to come back to that same spot over and over again. The authors of this paper suggest that this was actually a temporal place, in the sense that people weren't living there year round, but probably this is a seasonal thing where, hey, if you come down to this region where there's this abundant food source at this particular time of the year, say when it's not like really, really wet, or between the rainy season and then the dry season, and then you set up camp, or this is where you process your food at these particular mounds. And the mounds simply get larger and larger over time, to the point where you have literally millions of shells that are deposited at these particular locations. And you're now rising up higher and higher and higher and higher and higher than the area around you. And then what happens is that particular site becomes even more valuable, right? Because if you can be 4 feet, 5 feet higher, you can take a look out over the grasses. And you can see much farther, and you can see who's out there at another mound, and maybe you can see game, or right. That's going to be a very distinctive site in a place which is like perfectly flat for as far as you can see. And so what's really interesting about this site is not as if the authors don't suggest, and it sounds reasonable, that people didn't come to this place that was flat and say, like, let's pile up these shells right here so we can make a large mound. They simply, through typical behavior, ended up by accidentally making sites that had higher concentrations of shells than the area around them, and eventually became so useful that then they continue to come back to that site. But it wasn't necessary. We didn't necessarily have to do it with the thought of, hey, we're trying to make this large mound, because in 1,000 years from now, because we're going to talk about how long these mounds would have taken. Oh, well, you can see it right here. If you go with the carbon-14 datings, we're talking about from 4,000 years ago down here to 10,000 years ago. Over a 6,000 year period, you have this development of this large shell mound. So this isn't anything that I'm thinking about next year, how I'm going to have a large shell mound. This would have been the growth of this mound would have been so slight over time that even within a generation, you might not have noticed a big difference in the height of the mound or the usefulness of this particular mound. And so it wouldn't have been necessarily a conscious thing that you're going to eventually make a 6-foot high mound of shells that is 100 feet wide. I mean, you got to keep that in your mind. This is not just a little mound there where I step up, take a couple steps up, and then I can look around. This becomes a large area, right? 100, square feet of space that's all higher than the surrounding area. And that's a heck of a lot of shells, as I'll show you when we do the calculation. The snail shell that we're talking about is these are some ancient snail shells that are pulled out of the remains. Here's a 1 centimeter. So let's say, 1 inch at most. There's actually fairly large snail shells, which you can see why that would be a valuable resource, because you could collect one of these and it's actually a reasonable amount of food per snail shell. But really what it looks like is something like down here. I mean, when you dig into it, they're just crushed, right? There's hundreds, like I said before, hundreds of millions of snail shells that are all compacted in this particular place, represent just an enormous number of of eaten shells, which must have taken some time to produce. This isn't like somebody eating this many shells in 1 year. Here's a picture of some of the cores taken, and I only show this to show that you don't see discernible shells in here. These are all tiny shell fragments because of the compaction. And so, again, expressing the idea that there's just an enormous number of shells at this particular location. So how many shells? I did this little back-of-the-envelope calculation to estimate how long it would take to produce these particular mounds. So let's say let's take a medium mound, 100 feet by 100 feet times 5 feet deep. All right, so the mound is generally roundish, but let's turn it into a square, 100 feet by 100 feet, and then about 5 feet of snail shells. All right, some of them are thicker than that, but let's just stick with sort of an average type number. So that would be 50,000 cubic feet. Right, so one mound consists of 50,000 cubic feet of material. One snail. Now I'm way overestimating this. I'm going to say that one snail is 1 cubic inch. All right, one snail, that would be an unbroken shell. Right, it would have to take up that much volume. And so 1 cubic inch. So there are 12 inches times 12 inches times 12 inches, right? 1,728 cubic inches in a cubic foot. So per foot, you'd have 1,728 snail shells, right? 50,000 cubic feet, all right, times the number of snail shells per cubic foot will give you 86 million snail shells. All right, so that's 86 million snail shells to produce that mount. Now, this is I've already shown you the reason why this is a very low estimate. And it primarily has to do with the fact that I used 1 cubic inch per snail shell. A lot of the snail shells are smaller than that, and then they're completely crushed, right? The weight of people walking around on them constantly has crushed them and pulverized them such that it's probably more like 5 snail shells per cubic inch, at least, if not many more. But if it were 5 more, well, that's 5 times 86, 5 times 8, that's 400 million snail shells. And it doesn't seem unreasonable to suggest that some of these mounds contain 1 billion snail shells in them. But let's just say 100 million as kind of a low estimate given the amount of compaction that's occurred in these sites. So 100 million snail shells. How long would it take to deposit 100 million snail shells? Let's say we have a person and they're eating 15 snails per day. Right? That'd be a pretty good diet then, especially since you're going to mix it in with other things that you're eating. But let's say you found 15 snails, eating 15 snails a day. And let's say you have 10 people hanging out in this mound. So this is like a family unit or extended family unit that's hunting, gathering in this area, and they're using this mound. Remember, there's a mound only 300, 400 feet away, or maybe 1,000 feet away here and there. Right? There's other mounds around. So we're only talking about the development of a single mound. Let's say 10 people there. So that's 15 shells times 365 days of a year, which it's very unlikely they're spending all their time at this one particular site for an entire year. They're probably only migrating to this region, but let's just be really generous and say that one person every single day eats 15 snail shells, 5,470 snails per year, and there's 10 individuals all doing that every day. That's 54,700 snails per year per mound. Yeah, that's a lot of snails. And so that gives us, if we take our 100 million total snails in the mound altogether, divide by 54,700 snails per year, in terms of the deposition, how many are being deposited in that spot, we get 1,826 years, right? 1,800 years of people living there, eating there every single day in order to produce the mounds that we see. And this is a severe underestimate, right? I'm sure this is a considerable underestimate. there's definitely a lot more shells than I've estimated. The population, now let's think about just biologically speaking. Not only is one person probably not going to eat 15 snails every single day, they're probably going to have other things in their diet. And the snails are not always going to be available every single day. You think about 54,000 snails per year in a particular mound, but there's a mound that's not very far away. So that would mean if they're also eating 54,700 snails every single year, they have to find that many snails every single year. These are fairly large snails. And so you're living in an environment, let's say, even if the environment is conducive to snail life, if you have mound over here, a mound over there, and a mound back there, and you're right here, your particular area in which you can scavenge to find snails may not be very large. And if you only have a few acres, let's say you have 10 acres, maybe let's say you have 50 acres, are you going to find, well, let's say 15 a day times 10, that's 1,500 snails every single day. Did I do that right? 15 times, yeah. I'm sorry, 150 snails a day? Yeah, bad math. 150 snails a day, 150 large snails a day. You need to find that many every single day. What do you think is going to happen to the snail population? You're absolutely going to decimate that snail population, right? There has to be enough snails left for them to continue to reproduce and produce more snails, and they have to grow to the point where they're going to be large enough that it's worth eating. This is if people were there 365 days of the year and they were eating this much snail every single day, the snails would be extinct. And they'd probably be extinct within a year, not 1,800 years. And once they're gone, right, and they're not able to repopulate the region, there's not going to be any more snails being produced and deposited. And so it only makes sense that many fewer snails are being eaten per year at each one of these particular locations and deposited, because there just simply isn't going to be the snail production possible to produce that many snails in this particular region in this short a period of time. And as I said before, it's probably seasonal, not a year-round diet, and so that would also divide the number. So if you're only spending a third of your year there, and you're eating the same number of snails during that 1/3 of the year, which I think even that is unrealistic, but let's say you're doing that, that's 3 times 1,800, so now you're looking at 5,400 years to produce that many snail shells. Now, all these numbers actually kind of, the numbers I'm giving you fit the timeline of the carbon-14 dating. So I said 1,800 years is what we estimated based on these, highly unrealistic values, really. This would be like the fastest possible way that this shell midden would be formed. But the carbon-14 data suggest it actually has taken longer. It's taken from 10,000 years ago when it began. So that's when the first snail shells begin to show at the bottom of this mound. All the way up to about 4,000 years ago when the snail shells sort of tail off. And then what you have above there is you have deposits that are from pre-Columbian times. And so you have this pottery, and by the way, there's no pottery in this lower level in all the snail shell middens, even though there's all these hearths and all these other things. And so you have the pre-Columbian time period on top of all these shells. And then, so that's another thing you have to account for in terms of the chronology of this particular site. I think 4,000 to 10,000, 6,000 years, even that seems pretty amazing that that a group of individuals could produce a mound that large and hundreds of mounds this size in that time frame. And it does suggest they ate a lot of snails, right? That was a large portion of their diet at that particular time. But 6,000 years seems to fit within some of the parameters that I just calculated, right? It suggests seasonality. It suggests you just have groups of 10, maybe 15 or 20 people living at those sites. for short periods of time, and they're probably not eating, every single one of them is probably not eating 15 snails per day, because again, you would cause the snail population to go extinct. And it's very likely the way history really works is individuals, like, they need to survive. They probably ate snails when they had to eat snails, when they couldn't find other game. And there are times when they might have eaten too many snails, right? And they drove the snails to near extinction, and the snails had to then re-invade that particular area and grow to sufficient populations that it was worth then finding snails again as part of a large portion of the diet. And so there may have been periods in here in which you went for a dozen years, 20 years, 50 years, even 100 years, where maybe snail shells weren't even that abundant. And really the shell midden pile didn't grow very much. And then there were other times where it grew more. And the carbon dating sort of shows that there's it's not absolutely consistent that the snails piled up at the same rate all the time, which completely makes total sense in terms of population biology. Anyway, I found this paper. I remember when I first read it, I just thought it was just really intriguing that somebody could look out and say, well, that's really interesting. There's an island of trees out there. The elevation's slightly raised out there. How did that spot become the way it is? And then they start to dig down in this mound, and wow, this mound is made of all shells. Where could all these shells have come from? And then they find clear evidence that humans are involved at this particular site. And all of a sudden it becomes apparent that these are ancient peoples that, accidentally, right, resulted in making mounds of shells that raised the elevation in that area that eventually allowed trees to grow on this particular spot, creating these forest islands. They weren't necessarily forest islands when these individuals were producing these shells. And the other thing I would note here is that you also have this what's called modern soil. So these mounds were at one time were very high. They really stuck up way above everything else surrounding, probably above all the vegetation. And again, so I'd say these are really great lookout points. But then you had some kind of large flood event, or several flood events actually, that brought in the modern soils that are around it, and they almost buried the shell middens. And the authors even suggest that there probably are more mounds out there, right? Possibly thousands of more mounds that are out there in this whole region in Bolivia. But we can't see them because the mounds weren't as high, right? If you had a mound like this, which only reached 4 feet high, and then you had large amounts of flood sediment brought in during a time, they suggest this happened about 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. And then that brought in and just completely covered the mounds. There could be many mounds that are actually big mounds of shells created by human beings or caused by human beings, buried underneath that plain that you see out there, underneath the marshes out there. And it's only the very largest ones that have remained for us to see today. So another interesting example of sort of a hidden ancient landscape that was influenced by human occupation, right? Without human occupation in this area, we very likely would not have, I would say we wouldn't have these forest islands. Now, I should add one other thing before I stop. And that is, somebody might say, well, what about aren't there other hypotheses? Other things eat snails, right? There are hawks and there's a few other types of animals that might eat shells. Couldn't there have been a tree and then a hawk went out, caught snails, picked them up, brought them back, ate the snails, dropped the snail shell right there, and they just did that a lot, right, over a long period of time. Again, this would take thousands of years as well. No reason it would take any short amount of time. Probably might even take longer period of time. That's not at all an impossible biological scenario. However, the snails are missing their operculum, a portion of the snail, which suggests that they were taken off and then before the snail shell was brought to this location. And that probably wouldn't have happened if it had been caught by other organisms. And the real kicker here is that throughout the shell midden, There's clear signs of fire being produced at this particular site over and over and over and over again. And the types of other bones that are found here represent the types of bones and pieces of bones of parts of animals that would have been brought back here to be processed. And again, you could employ for any one of these things. You could say, well, maybe this is leopards or something like that. That now, because there's a mound there, which they obviously didn't cause the mound, bringing the snail shells there and producing the mound first in order to have the leopards even think this is a good spot to sort of hang out. And all of those things are plausible scenarios for why some of those things are there. But when you put it all together, the snail shells, the compaction, the operculum's missing, the fire, the types of materials that are found there, and the fact that, for 4,000 years, pre-Columbian individuals also found these sites very useful, probably as hunting camps. They obviously didn't eat snails like the people before them as much, but nonetheless, this all looks like a human-induced effect at this particular location. And there was probably some natural part of this, right? There's going to be animals that also visit these sites and leave things behind because of how unique this location is. But nonetheless, this is a human-caused landscape phenomena. All right, well, that's the story of Amazonian forest islands. Thanks for listening, and you can find more of, actually I've written about this particular site, and I have more details on the calculations I did there at thenaturalhistorian.com, and I'll put the link below this this video. And hey, please subscribe if you found this information at all interesting. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.